In the spring of 1943, as the Pacific War ground forward island by island, an unassuming American design began appearing along beaches and coral shelves. It was squat, slow, and awkward in profile. It did not carry heavy guns. It did not look like a machine meant to decide battles. Compared to the sleek fighters overhead or the steel hulls offshore, it seemed almost apologetic in its presence. Nothing about it suggested revolution. Across the water, Japanese defenders prepared for a fight they believed they understood. For nearly 2 years, they had refined a brutal equation: force the enemy to land under fire, bleed them at the shoreline, then annihilate them inland through caves, bunkers, and prepared kill zones. Beaches were measured. Approaches were mapped. Every likely movement had already been rehearsed in the defenders' minds. This would be another costly American assault, no different from the last. The irony was that the most decisive tool now approaching those islands was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It was not designed to destroy enemy positions or silence artillery. It did not exist to kill. Instead, it solved a quieter problem, one so basic it had long been accepted as inevitable: how men and supplies moved from ship to shore, how momentum was preserved in the most fragile moment of an amphibious assault. Japanese island defenses had been engineered to stop ships, tanks, and infantry in sequence. Naval guns would be outranged or avoided. Tanks would bog down, or for decades, amphibious warfare had been understood through the language of firepower. Success was measured in guns landed, shells fired, and defenses crushed under weight of steel. Movement was treated as secondary, an unavoidable pause between ship and shore. In planning rooms across the world, it was assumed that chaos at the waterline was simply the price of invasion. The American design that emerged in the early 1942s rejected that assumption. It was not conceived to dominate the battlefield, but to pass through it. Its priorities were modest and almost unmilitary: reliability, buoyancy, repetition. It did not promise speed or protection. It promised that it would work again, and then again after that, under conditions that guaranteed failure for more refined machines. The irony was unmistakable. What appeared unsophisticated was addressing the most stubborn problem of island war: coral reefs that shredded hulls, surf that stalled engines, narrow beaches that turned landings into traffic jams under fire. This machine did not overcome those obstacles with force. It ignored them. It moved when it should not have been able to move, and by doing so, it quietly removed the enemy's greatest advantage. Japanese fortifications had been designed around delay. Every bunker, trench, and overlapping field of fire assumed attackers would arrive in waves that could be predicted, stalled, and broken apart. Time was the defender's ally. The longer men were trapped between ship and shore, the more lethal the island became. That logic held until it didn't. Behind the American solution was a human choice rarely celebrated in war. Engineers assumed things would go wrong. Engines would fail. Crews would make mistakes. Conditions would be worse than expected. So the design did not chase perfection. It chased tolerance. Parts could be replaced. Hulls could be repaired. Losses could be absorbed without collapsing the system. In that quiet design, philosophy lay a strategic revelation. Simplicity, multiplied at scale, could outperform brilliance. And as the first landings proved that movement itself could become a weapon, a deeper question emerged: what happens to an island defense when the beach is no longer a choke point at all? When the first waves reached shore, something felt wrong, at least to those watching from prepared positions. American forces were not stalling at the waterline. They were moving. Vehicles climbed out of the surf, crossed sand that should have trapped them, and pressed inland with a speed that defied expectation. The moment that was supposed to belong to the defenders was already slipping away. Japanese commanders initially dismissed what they were seeing. In war, anomalies happen. Weather shifts. Units make mistakes. A single landing arriving ahead of schedule did not invalidate years of doctrine. The assumption was that once the Americans reached the obstacles, once fire found its mark, momentum would break as it always had. The island would reassert its authority. Instead, defensive plans began to unravel almost immediately. Beach obstacles designed to channel men into kill zones were bypassed or ignored. Fields of fire opened onto empty sand. Guns waited for targets that never appeared where they were supposed to. The defenders had prepared to stop an assault that no longer followed the script. The struggle was no longer about holding ground. but about understanding what had changed. Obstacles that once bought precious minutes now bought nothing at all. Momentum did not pause. Supplies followed troops without interruption. Commanders inland began receiving reports that made little sense, units advancing faster than projected, positions threatened from unexpected directions, contact occurring hours ahead of schedule. The irony was sharp. The strongest defenses on the island remained intact, while the weaker ones were suddenly irrelevant. The Americans were not tearing through fortifications. They were stepping around them. The careful architecture of resistance had been rendered obsolete not by superior firepower, but by uninterrupted movement. Only then did the revelation settle in. Island defenses were being bypassed, not breached. The beach, once the decisive battlefield, had become a mere transition, and as Japanese commanders struggled to reorient their forces, a new and unsettling reality took shape. If the shoreline could no longer slow the enemy, the entire logic of island defense was in question. By 1943, Japanese strategy in the Pacific had hardened into a single, immovable belief. Islands could be transformed into fortresses. Each garrison was expected to fight in place, drawing strength from terrain, preparation, and sacrifice. Reinforcement was uncertain. Withdrawal was unthinkable. Victory, if it came at all, would come from making the enemy pay an unbearable price at the point of landing. At the center of this thinking was the beach. It was assumed to be decisive, the narrow strip where attackers were exposed, disorganized, and vulnerable. Every calculation flowed from that assumption. Guns were sighted to rake the surf. Obstacles were placed to slow armor. Kill zones were drawn with mathematical care. The beach was not merely ground. It was the moment when an invasion could be broken before it truly began. The shock came not from defeat, but from timing. Within hours of the first landings, the battlefield had already shifted inland. American units were appearing beyond positions that had not yet fired a shot. Defensive lines designed to engage an enemy at the shoreline found themselves irrelevant before they were tested. The fortress was intact, but the fight was happening somewhere else. This was the cruel irony of static defense. Fixed positions draw their strength from predictability. They assume the enemy will arrive as expected, move as expected, and pause where expected. When those assumptions collapse, strength becomes rigidity. Guns that cannot move cannot adapt. Bunkers that dominate one approach are blind to another. Japanese commanders now faced a struggle their doctrine had never truly addressed. Orders emphasized holding ground that no longer mattered. Units remained tied to positions that were being bypassed rather than assaulted. Communication faltered as American forces advanced faster than planned, severing links between isolated strongpoints. The island, once imagined as a single integrated fortress, began to fracture into disconnected pockets of resistance. The revelation was not immediate, but it was devastating. Preparation itself had become a trap. Years of effort had locked Japan into a posture that could not respond to a war of movement. Flexibility, long dismissed as weakness, was now proving decisive. The defenders were brave, disciplined, and committed, yet increasingly out of position. As the fighting moved inland, the true cost of this mentality emerged. Fortresses are built to endure sieges, not to chase momentum. And as Japanese forces clung to the logic of the beach, the Americans were already shaping the battle beyond it, raising a question that would soon confront every island garrison still waiting at the shoreline. Japanese defensive doctrine rested on a powerful assumption. Stronger bunkers and heavier guns could stop any landing. Concrete, steel, and precision engineering were expected to impose order on chaos. If each position held, if each weapon performed as designed, the enemy would be shattered long before reaching the island's interior. Strength was measured in permanence. The shock came not from the failure of these weapons, but from their context. American systems, plain, repetitive, and unremarkable, continued to function under fire, in mud, and through surf that choked engines and blinded crews. They broke down, were repaired, and returned again. Where Japanese defenses demanded ideal conditions to operate at peak effectiveness, American movement tolerated degradation without collapse. The irony was quiet but decisive. Ingenuity, when chained to precision, proved fragile. A bunker designed to dominate a specific arc was formidable until the fight moved beyond that arc. A gun calibrated for maximum effect was lethal until supply lines were disrupted or visibility failed. The very refinement that gave these systems their power also limited their adaptability. As the battle unfolded, this struggle became increasingly apparent. Japanese defenses relied on assumptions of timing, terrain, and sequence. They expected the enemy to pause, to regroup, to expose themselves in predictable ways. But momentum refused to conform. American forces advanced even when plans unraveled. Vehicles reached positions they were never meant to reach. Supplies arrived where no road had been cleared. Chaos did not halt the assault, it fed it. The turning point was not marked by a single breakthrough, but by a realization. Once movement could be sustained under fire, it could not be easily stopped. Each minute gained inland compounded the next. Defensive positions that remained intact were rendered irrelevant as the battle flowed around them. Firepower that could not relocate became a spectator. This was the collapse of over-engineering in its purest form. Systems built for perfection could not survive imperfection. Designs optimized for control failed in an environment defined by friction. Meanwhile, simpler systems designed to accept loss, error, and abuse continued to function long after elegance had failed. By the time Japanese commanders grasped this imbalance, the damage was irreversible. Complexity had not been defeated by superior design, but by chaos itself. And as momentum carried the Americans deeper inland, a broader truth was emerging, one that would reshape how wars of movement were fought across the Pacific. For generations, military thinking had favored quality over quantity. Better training, better equipment, better soldiers. These were expected to offset numerical disadvantage. In theory, a smaller force, if refined enough, could hold against a larger one. This belief shaped how Japan armed, trained, and deployed its island garrisons across the Pacific. The shock came with scale. The American design did not arrive as a rare asset to be protected. It arrived in numbers that defied expectation. Dozens became hundreds. Losses were anticipated, even planned for. Machines damaged by fire or surf were abandoned without hesitation, replaced by others already moving forward. The system did not pause to mourn its own attrition. The irony was strategic and unsettling. Individual losses no longer mattered in the way defenders expected them to. Destroying one machine did not slow the landing. Destroying 10 did not stop it. The defenders were fighting targets that did not represent decisive value on their own. Victory, at the tactical level, no longer translated into strategic effect. This created a struggle that Japanese forces could not resolve in time. Defensive doctrine required adaptation, shifting fire, repositioning units, recalculating threats, but the pace of movement allowed no such recalibration. Before one problem could be solved, another appeared farther inland. The defenders were always responding to where the enemy had been, not where he was going. What emerged was a revelation about industrial war. Victory favored what could be replaced faster than it could be destroyed. American production turned loss into a temporary inconvenience. Training pipelines replaced crews. Factories replaced hulls. Momentum, once established, became independent of individual survival. The battlefield reflected this imbalance with brutal clarity. Burned-out machines littered beaches that no longer mattered. Intact defenses stood idle as fighting shifted beyond their reach. The logic of perfection of crafting systems, meant never to fail, collapsed under the weight of repetition. By the time this reality settled in, the defenders were trapped between two impossibilities. They could not destroy enough to matter, and they could not adapt fast enough to compensate. Mass had not merely supported the American advance, it had insulated it. And as island after island fell to the same pattern, the war revealed its preference, not for what was flawless, but for what could be endlessly replaced. Under normal circumstances, the landing phase of an amphibious assault was the moment of greatest danger. Troops were compressed into narrow spaces, exposed, disorganized, and dependent on timing they could not control. Supplies piled up where they were least useful. Vehicles waited their turn, engines idling while artillery searched for them. In past wars, this fragile interval decided everything. In 1943, that logic began to dissolve. Troops, supplies, and vehicles reached shore not in waves separated by pause and confusion, but in a continuous flow. Men stepped off ramps and moved forward without waiting for the beach to clear. Crates of ammunition followed them. Fuel, radios, medical equipment, and food appeared where they were needed, not hours later, but minutes. The shoreline no longer felt like an edge. It felt like a thoroughfare. The irony was unmistakable. The most vulnerable phase of the assault the moment defenders had built their entire doctrine around was fading from existence. There was no single instant to exploit, no mass of stalled men to concentrate fire upon. Targets appeared, disappeared, and reappeared, farther inland before guns could be reoriented. Exposure was diluted by motion. For Japanese defenders, pressure mounted in a form they had not prepared for. Timing had always been their ally. The pause between landing waves allowed guns to cool, crews to reposition, commanders to assess. That rhythm was gone. Fire missions overlapped. Ammunition ran low, faster than expected. Orders arrived late or not at all. The defenders were forced to react continuously, without the pauses that made reaction possible. Reports from the front reflected growing confusion. Units expected to engage at the shoreline found the enemy already beyond them. Others opened fire only to discover they were striking empty sand. The beach, once the focal point of resistance, became a blur of movement rather than a fixed line. Even when machines were destroyed, their absence was immediately filled by others pressing forward. The human experience of the landing changed as well. American troops were still under fire, still vulnerable, still afraid, but they were not trapped. Movement gave them purpose. Forward motion reduced the sense of helpless waiting that had defined earlier assaults. The psychology of the landing shifted from endurance to action, from survival to advance. This did not make the fighting easier. Inland combat remained brutal and uncertain. But the character of the battle had already been decided. Japanese defenders were being denied the one moment they had prepared to dominate. Their firepower was intact, their courage unquestioned. Yet their influence over the battle's opening hours was slipping away. The revelation, when it came, was stark. The beach was no longer a choke point. It was no longer the decisive arena where invasions lived or died. It had become a transitional space, important but fleeting. Control of time, not terrain, was now the decisive factor. As the fighting pushed deeper inland, Japanese commanders confronted an uncomfortable truth. If the landing itself could no longer be broken, then every subsequent defense would begin already compromised. And on islands still waiting for invasion, men stood watch over beaches that were quietly losing their meaning. Japanese defensive thinking remained anchored to a familiar belief: destroy the landing craft, and the invasion collapses. The logic was sound on paper. If attackers could be stopped before reaching shore, their numerical and industrial advantages would be neutralized. Every island plan reflected this assumption. Guns were sighted low. Fields of fire converged on the surf. Ammunition stocks were allocated for the decisive opening minutes. The shock came with realization of what they were facing. The American design was not rare, nor precious. It was cheap, expendable, and everywhere. Where earlier invasions had depended on limited numbers of specialized craft, this system arrived in floods. New silhouettes replaced old ones almost immediately. Destruction did not create absence. It created space for the next arrival. The irony was brutal. Shooting one changed nothing. A hit that would have been celebrated in earlier battles now carried no strategic weight. Crews abandoned damaged machines and kept moving. Supplies floated ashore on replacements already inbound. The act of resistance no longer produced the delay it was meant to enforce. This created a grinding struggle over resources. Japanese gunners continued to fire because doctrine demanded it, not because results justified it. Ammunition disappeared into the surf, into hulls that burned briefly and then vanished from relevance. Every shell spent on the shoreline was a shell not available inland, where the fight was rapidly migrating. As minutes turned into hours, a turning point emerged that was not marked by silence, but by futility. Defensive fire lost its meaning. Guns remained active, but their effect on the outcome diminished with each passing wave. Commanders could not tell whether their efforts were succeeding or failing, because the enemy advance no longer correlated with visible destruction. The defenders were trapped in a feedback loop they could not escape. To stop the landings, they had to fire. But firing did not stop the landings. Adjusting targets inland came too late, and repositioning heavy weapons under pressure was often impossible. The system had been designed to dominate a single moment. That moment no longer existed. The revelation, when it became unavoidable, cut deeper than any tactical setback. Saturation defeats resistance. When targets are too many, too replaceable, and too continuous, defense loses its ability to impose cost. Courage and discipline remain, but influence evaporates. The defender is reduced to endurance without leverage. This was not a failure of bravery or preparation. It was a mismatch between assumptions and reality. Japanese forces were fighting the invasion they had trained for, not the one unfolding before them. By the time that distinction was understood, it was already too late. As the beaches once ashore, the true measure of an invasion was no longer the courage of the men who landed, but the rhythm of what followed them. In earlier wars, beachheads were fragile creations, thin lines of survival that had to be defended while commanders waited for supplies to catch up. In the Pacific of 1943, that pause never came. Supplies flowed inland without interruption, carried by a system that refused to recognize the shoreline as a boundary. Ammunition reached the front before shortages could form. Medical stations appeared almost as soon as casualties occurred. Fuel arrived not in dramatic convoys, but in steady, unremarkable volume. Radios, spare parts, and food followed the same pattern. What might have looked chaotic from a distance was, in fact, methodical. Movement replaced accumulation. Nothing waited long enough to become vulnerable. The irony was that bravery, though abundant on both sides, was no longer the decisive factor. Japanese defenders fought with determination and, often, desperation. American troops advanced under fire, absorbing losses that were real and painful. Yet the outcome was being shaped elsewhere, in the quiet certainty that men at the front would not be abandoned by the systems behind them. Logistics, not heroism, was driving victory. Pressure built slowly but relentlessly. Japanese positions that had survived initial contact found themselves increasingly isolated. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Medical care became improvised or non-existent. Reinforcement was impossible. Each hour that passed tightened the American grip, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through the steady erosion of options. The defenders' struggle became one of endurance without relief. Fixed positions that once offered security now became traps. Movement invited exposure. Remaining still invited encirclement. The island itself seemed to shrink as American forces expanded their operational reach, supplied continuously from a shoreline that no longer functioned as a rear area, but as an open artery. The revelation was stark and deeply unsettling. Island battles were becoming unwinnable, not because Japanese soldiers lacked skill or resolve, but because the structure of the fight denied them recovery. Losses could not be replaced. Gains could not be consolidated. Time, once an ally of the defender, had been captured by the attacker. This transformation altered the meaning of resistance. Courage could delay defeat, but it could not reverse it. Tactical successes faded as soon as they were achieved. Overwhelmed by fresh supplies and reinforced units arriving with mechanical regularity, what remained was attrition without leverage. As the battle moved toward its conclusion, the beachhead itself faded from memory. It had done its job and ceased to matter. The breakthrough was not marked by a single dramatic moment, but by the quiet recognition that the outcome was no longer in doubt. And as news of these battles filtered back through command channels and intelligence reports, planners on both sides began to understand the implications. The Pacific War was entering a phase where islands would fall not because they were assaulted, but because, for centuries, the shoreline had been the decisive edge of invasion. It was where armies arrived at their weakest, where geography compressed force into vulnerability. Fortresses, mines, and guns had all been designed with this moment in mind. In the Pacific War, that ancient logic reached its breaking point. The shock was not sudden, but unmistakable. Beaches stopped functioning as battlefields. They were crossed, not contested. Fire still fell. Men still died. But the outcome was no longer decided there. The decisive hours passed inland, beyond the reach of defenses that had been built to dominate the surf. The shoreline became a corridor rather than a crucible. The irony was severe. Japan's strongest defenses, carefully emplaced, meticulously surveyed, and courageously manned, were being bypassed. Guns waited for targets that moved past them. Obstacles remained intact long after the enemy had gone. Years of preparation held their form, even as their purpose evaporated. Recognizing this shift required a painful reassessment. Japanese commanders began adjusting doctrine, emphasizing defense in depth rather than annihilation at the waterline. But this turning point came too late. Units were already committed to fixed positions. Terrain that could not be abandoned trapped men in roles that no longer mattered. Adaptation, though attempted, was constrained by earlier certainty. This delay revealed a deeper truth about modern war. Once an invasion model breaks, it cannot be repaired mid-battle. The assumptions that guide training, construction, and logistics take years to build and moments to invalidate. By the time the beach was recognized as a secondary concern, the attacker had already internalized a new rhythm of war. The revelation was stark. The decisive beach, the idea that an invasion could be shattered at the shoreline, was finished. Control of movement, supply, and tempo now defined success. The battle began not when men landed, but when systems started flowing. Resistance that failed to disrupt that flow could no longer decide outcomes. This transformation reshaped the Pacific Campaign. Islands once thought impregnable became liabilities rather than strongholds. Garrisoning a beach no longer guaranteed influence over the battle. The defenders' leverage had shifted inland, and even there it was shrinking. For the soldiers on those islands, this shift carried a cruel weight. They fought with the same discipline and resolve, but under conditions that denied them strategic effect. Sacrifice remained, but its ability to change the war diminished. The ground they held mattered less than the time they could no longer control. As the smoke cleared from successive landings, a new understanding settled over planners and commanders alike. The invasion had been redefined. What began as a technical solution to a logistical problem had overturned centuries of military thinking. And as attention turned toward the next islands, and then the next, a quiet question lingered. If the beach was no longer decisive, what, if anything, could stop a system designed to move endlessly forward? Once the fighting moved inland, the war assumed a different and far harsher character for Japanese troops. The sea that had once defined their defensive plans now offered no relief. Supply routes were severed or irrelevant. Positions that had been stocked for a decisive stand at the shoreline were suddenly distant from the battle that mattered. Isolation became the defining condition of resistance. Food ran short first, then ammunition. Medical supplies followed. Wounded men were treated with what remained, often without anesthesia, often without hope of evacuation. Messages sent to higher command went unanswered or arrived too late to matter. The struggle was no longer about repelling an invasion, but about enduring its consequences. The irony was cruel and unmistakable. Fortresses designed to resist assault became prisons. Caves and bunkers that had promised protection now confined those inside them, cutting off movement and flexibility. Terrain that had once been an ally turned into a trap as American forces advanced past fixed positions and sealed them off from one another. A turning point emerged quietly, without ceremony. Resistance continued, but its purpose shifted. Attacks were launched not to regain ground, but to affirm presence. Holding a position became less about influencing the outcome and more about fulfilling obligation. The fight took on a symbolic weight that no longer matched its strategic value. American forces, supplied continuously and advancing deliberately, adapted to this reality with grim efficiency. Isolated pockets were contained, bypassed, and reduced in turn. The war inland was not fast, but it was methodical. Time favored the side that could wait, and waiting was a luxury only one side possessed. For Japanese soldiers, the psychological burden was immense. They fought, knowing relief would not come. Every engagement consumed irreplaceable resources. Every loss was final. Yet discipline and cohesion often held long after rational calculation suggested surrender. Doctrine, honor, and duty filled the vacuum left by strategy. The revelation, when it could no longer be avoided, was devastating. Defeat had become inevitable, not because of a single catastrophic failure, but because the structure of the war offered no path back. Even victories at the local level changed nothing. The outcome was being decided by systems beyond the reach of those still fighting. This realization did not end resistance, but it changed its meaning. The war became a series of isolated struggles bound by courage but disconnected from hope. Islands that had once anchored defensive lines now absorbed men without altering the advance that flowed around them. As the inland fighting dragged on, the broader campaign moved forward regardless. New landings were planned. New islands were targeted. The men still fighting in the interior became ghosts of a battle already concluded elsewhere. And as reports filtered back through Japanese command channels, the implications grew impossible to ignore. If inland resistance could no longer shape outcomes, then the war had entered a terminal phase 1, in which endurance itself was no longer a strategy, but a final gesture against the inevitable. What had begun as a solution to a narrow problem now revealed a far broader consequence. The design worked everywhere, on coral reefs that shredded conventional hulls, in mangrove swamps where roads did not exist, along jungle coastlines where maps were little more than guesses. It functioned not because conditions were favorable, but because it did not require them to be. Geography, once a powerful ally of the defender, was steadily losing its influence. This was the shock that settled in across the Pacific. The system did not need to be reimagined for each new island. It adapted without redesign, absorbing local conditions rather than fighting them. What had once demanded bespoke planning and specialized equipment could now be repeated with minor variation. War became procedural. The irony was profound. Japan had relied on the uniqueness of each island, its reefs, its terrain, its isolation to multiply defensive strength. Adaptability, long considered a secondary virtue, now determined survival. The side that could apply the same method everywhere gained an advantage. No single fortress could counter. This realization marked a turning point in the campaign. Island hopping accelerated. Targets were chosen not solely for their strength, but for their position within a shrinking strategic map. Strong points were bypassed entirely, left isolated and irrelevant. The war no longer advanced by grinding through every defense, but by stepping around them with calculated momentum. Each successful landing reinforced the next. Experience accumulated, procedures improved, timing tightened. What had once required experimentation became routine. The system learned faster than the defender could adapt. Japanese commanders found themselves reacting not to individual battles, but to a pattern they could neither disrupt nor reverse. The deeper revelation was strategic. Japan was losing depth. Every island surrendered, bypassed, or neutralized reduced the space in which resistance could operate. Supply lines contracted. Airfields disappeared. Warning time shortened. The perimeter that once absorbed pressure now transmitted it directly inward. This erosion was not dramatic, but it was relentless. There was no single collapse to point to, no moment when the defense visibly failed. Instead, options vanished one by one. Each loss narrowed the future. Each successful American landing reduced the number of choices available to Japanese command. The system's power lay in its indifference to heroism or terrain. It did not require decisive battles to succeed. It required continuity. As long as movement could be sustained, the outcome was only a matter of time. Resistance could slow the process, but it could not redirect it. For Japanese forces still fighting, this reality was often invisible. Battles were intense, personal, and deadly. Courage remained constant. But beyond those fights, the strategic map was already being redrawn. Islands still held were no longer anchors, they were liabilities. By late 1943 and into 1944, the implications were unmistakable. The Pacific was no longer a series of isolated contests. It had become a corridor. The system that enabled this transformation could not be stopped because it did not depend on winning any single battle. By late 1943, a pattern had emerged that was impossible to ignore. Each landing took less time than the last. What had once required careful rehearsal and costly improvisation now unfolded with practiced certainty. The system moved forward with growing confidence, not because resistance weakened, but because efficiency deepened. This was the consequence of repetition. Crews knew their roles before orders were spoken. Timelines tightened. Coordination between sea, shore, and inland units improved with every operation. Mistakes still occurred, but they were absorbed without halting momentum. Experience, accumulated across dozens of landings, began to outweigh the uncertainties of terrain and weather. The irony was that surprise, long considered the decisive ingredient of amphibious warfare, was becoming less important. Japanese defenders often knew where the next blow would fall. They prepared accordingly, reinforcing positions and stockpiling supplies. Yet knowledge no longer translated into advantage. Familiarity with the invasion method neutralized the value of anticipation. Each successful landing compounded the next. Equipment was standardized. Procedures were refined. Lessons learned on one island were applied almost immediately on another. The invasion force became a learning organism, improving not through inspiration, but through iteration. Momentum replaced surprise as the primary driver of success. For Japanese forces, this created a grim realization. Even when defenses held longer than expected, the delay changed nothing beyond the local fight. Time no longer accumulated in their favor. Every day gained by resistance was offset by the attacker's expanding experience. The learning curve belonged to only one side. This shift altered the psychological balance of the campaign. American planners began to assume success not because resistance would be light, but because systems would hold. Japanese commanders, facing the same pattern repeatedly, were forced to plan for battles they no longer believed could be won. Preparation became ritual rather than strategy. The revelation was stark. Momentum had become self-sustaining. Each landing did not merely capture ground, it improved the capacity to capture the next. The war advanced through compounding efficiency, not dramatic breakthroughs. What once required boldness now required continuity. As island after island fell faster than projected, the meaning of defense changed. Strong points still exacted a price, but they no longer imposed delay, proportional to their cost. The balance between effort and effect collapsed. Resistance remained courageous, but increasingly symbolic. This was not the failure of individual commanders or units. It was the consequence of a system meeting repetition. Japanese doctrine, built around singular decisive moments, could not compete with a method that improved through use. The more it was tested, the stronger it became. By the time this reality fully settled in, the Pacific campaign had gained an irreversible tempo. The islands were no longer stepping stones for the men who rode these machines toward hostile shores. Faith was not an abstract concept. It was practical. It lived in engines that started when they were supposed to, in hulls that did not fail when the surf rose, in ramps that dropped without hesitation. In a war defined by uncertainty, reliability became something to believe in. Troops did not speak of elegance or innovation. They spoke of trust. They learned quickly which designs would bring them back and which would not. When time came to board again, often under fire, that knowledge mattered more than doctrine. Predictability offered a form of calm that training alone could not provide. The irony was subtle but profound. Confidence did not come from superiority or bravado. It came from repetition, from the knowledge that the same simple motions would yield the same results. In a landscape where nothing else could be controlled, this consistency anchored men facing the unknown. Accounts from veterans often return to these details. The sound of engines pushing through surf, the smell of fuel and salt, the moment when boots touched ground and movement resumed without delay. These were not dramatic memories, but they endured because they worked. Survival, in many cases, was linked not to heroics, but to dependable design. This reliability shaped behavior under fire. Men moved forward sooner. Units reorganized faster. Fear did not vanish, but it no longer paralyzed. Trust in the system reduced hesitation, and hesitation in war often proves fatal. The machine did not make soldiers braver, but it allowed bravery to be used rather than wasted. The revelation here is easily overlooked. Trust is a weapon. When soldiers believe the tools around them will function, they take risks that would otherwise be unthinkable. They advance where doubt would stall them. They recover from shock faster because the world still behaves in predictable ways. This faith also carried moral weight. It bound individuals to a collective effort larger than themselves. Each successful landing reinforced belief in the system and in those who built it. The war, for all its violence, became a collaboration between human resolve and mechanical reliability. Japanese soldiers, by contrast, often faced battles where predictability had collapsed. Supplies failed to arrive. Positions were bypassed. Relief never came. The contrast was not one of courage, but of confidence. One side could trust continuity, the other could not. As the campaign moved closer to its conclusion, this difference grew more pronounced. Men who had landed dozens of times carried themselves differently. They knew what awaited them, not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. Familiarity, in war, is a rare advantage. In the end, the story of these machines is inseparable from the men who relied on them. Design alone does not win wars. But when design earns trust, it multiplies human effort beyond what numbers can explain. And as the final islands came into view, that quiet confidence built on simple things done well. By the end of the Pacific War, The contrast could no longer be ignored. Japan had fortified the islands. America had simplified the war. One side invested faith in precision, permanence, and decisive moments. The other built for repetition, tolerance, and motion. Between those choices lay the outcome of an ocean-spanning conflict. Simplicity did not announce itself as a philosophy. It arrived disguised as compromise. Designs that accepted loss, systems that assumed error, plans that favored continuity over control. What appeared crude was, in fact, an admission of reality that war is not fought under ideal conditions, and that systems which demand perfection rarely survive contact with chaos. This was the deeper irony of the Pacific. Japanese defenses were intelligent, disciplined, and often brilliantly executed. They were also bound to theory. They assumed the beach would be decisive, that delay would accumulate, that precision would impose order. American methods assumed the opposite, that friction was inevitable, that delay was deadly, and that order must emerge from movement rather than planning alone. Engineering for reality defeated engineering for ideals. Machines that could be repaired in the field outlasted those that could only function as designed. Processes that absorbed failure continued forward while refined solutions stalled. In this contest, elegance proved fragile. Endurance proved decisive. The moral closure of this story is not a celebration of destruction, but a caution about certainty. Wars are often lost by clinging too tightly to what ought to work. The Pacific was won by those willing to accept what would work again and again, under conditions that punished inflexibility without mercy. This does not diminish the courage of those who fought on either side. Japanese soldiers defended their islands with resolve that never faltered. American troops advanced through fire and uncertainty with determination earned at great cost. But courage alone did not decide the war. The structure surrounding that courage did. What the Pacific revealed was a shift in how wars would be decided in the modern age, not by singular victories, but by systems that deny the enemy decisive moments altogether. Not by overwhelming brilliance, but by sustained adequacy applied without pause. Momentum became morality's uncomfortable partner. In the years that followed, historians would debate tactics, leadership, and strategy. Yet beneath every analysis lay a quieter truth. The war moved forward because it could not be stopped once it began to move. Distance failed, terrain failed, fortification failed. Not because they were weak, but because they were too specific for a conflict defined by scale and repetition. The simplicity that won the Pacific was not naive. It was deliberate. It was the choice to value continuity over control, replacement over preservation, and function over form. It accepted loss without surrendering purpose. It turned logistics into leverage and time into a weapon. In the end, the islands did not fall because they were poorly defended. They fell because defense had been framed around a moment that no longer mattered. The beach ceased to decide the battle. The fortress ceased to define resistance. The war became something else, something simpler, and therefore harder to stop. This is the quiet lesson that lingers. Complexity promises mastery. Simplicity promises survival. In the Pacific, survival scaled. Mastery did not. They fortified the islands. America simplified the war. It was not elegant. It was unstoppable.